Next up is Keith Klugman from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Keith is is director for pneumonia, has a lot of experience in pneumonia-related vaccines, and as we heard yesterday, the impact of respiratory infections and the inappropriate use of antimicrobials, it's a real issue. And so Keith's going to talk to us about how we can leverage vaccines and vaccination to reduce AMR burden. Keith.
So thank you very much. Also want to say how much I've enjoyed this this meeting. Making us human ID docs into kind of animal folk is fascinating, and I'm learning so much. It's really great. So I'm going to talk about vaccines and try to make the argument that in a world of increasing AMR, vaccines have been under-researched and have not been sufficiently, in my view, prioritized as a modality to deal with AMR. So the majority of my talk, and most of what I have to say is on this rather overcrowded slide, is about humans, but I'm also going to delve a little bit into what at least I've learned about potential for vaccines in animals to reduce resistance. So in fact, we have quite a lot of data on the human side, and most of it is related, in fact, to a key vaccine which prevents respiratory infections. We all know that the vast majority of antibiotics are given for respiratory infections. And so I'll cover what we know about pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, which is a key vaccine to prevent respiratory infections in kids and also has impact in adults. And the data we have, in fact, are quite convincing. I think I'll show you not only vaccine impact on resistance, but also vaccine impact on antibiotic use. And so we know how hard it is to change use patterns if all you have to do is give a vaccine and then you don't have to worry about changing behavior. That's obviously a very potent way to reduce antibiotic use. But there are a bunch of other vaccines that are given to humans for which we have no data, at least, on impact on either antibiotic resistance or use, and I list them there in red. So the Hib vaccine is very similar vaccine rolled out many years before the pneumococcal vaccine. Haemophilus influenzae type B, in fact, was more resistant to beta-lactams than most non-typable Haemophilus, but there are no published papers, to my knowledge, on specific impact of Hib vaccine on antimicrobial resistance in that pathogen. The same thing, cholera vaccines are out there now. There are no data on cholera vaccine impact on resistance in cholera. Meningococcal vaccines, even TB, so BCG has been around forever, couldn't find a paper on BCG impact on resistance. So I'll mention a couple of other bacterial vaccines that are under development, which lend themselves to these sorts of impact studies. So typhoid vaccines, non-typhoid salmonella, we've heard a lot about at this meeting, and even group B strep. So group B strep is not a particularly resistant pathogen. It has macrolide resistance, but if you consider that a third of pregnant women today get antibiotics for fear of group B strep, in other words, to prevent transmission, a vaccine could have a huge impact on use. The second bullet up there then refers to something that has not really been discussed much here, and that is that if you have a vaccine that doesn't impact a resistant bacterial pathogen, but impacts a viral pathogen, you can also impact antibiotic use. So because we are lousy at differentiating bacterial and viral causes of respiratory infections, and as we've heard, otitis media, other respiratory infections are a huge use of antibiotics issue. If you can roll out a flu vaccine or a measles vaccine or any other respiratory vaccine, RSV vaccine, could you impact antibiotic use? And so for influenza, in fact, there are a couple of really nice studies, and one very recent one that I'll share with you on impact on antibiotic use. So even though the pathogen itself is not relevant, we're not looking at resistance to neuraminidase here in flu, but simply using a viral vaccine could reduce antibiotic use and therefore the attendant selection of strains in the flora. And then finally, there are a whole bunch of key pathogens which everybody on the human side here would recognize as the key resistant pathogens for which we have no vaccines at all. So Ephicalis Staph aureus has been a graveyard for vaccine manufacturers. Quite interesting, and I don't know that I've got much time for anecdotes, but autologous vaccines that we just heard about in the last talk, this was the rage in the 1940s, was autologous vaccines for staph. Bring in your staph and we'll just kill it and give it back to you and save you from carriage of your own staph. It was not a huge success story, but anyway, it's in the past. Klebs, Acinetobacter, Pseudomonas, none of these do we have existing vaccines, and they lend themselves not only to vaccines, because there are two key areas where I believe that AMR is critical. We've heard quite a lot about nosocomial infections, and that's where most antibiotics are used, and that's where most resistant pathogens have a major play. But the key for us at the foundation is neonatal sepsis. And neonatal sepsis, we believe, is becoming increasingly untreatable, particularly in the developing world. And what these share is a very short window of susceptibility. So alternate approaches to antibiotics, such as monoclonals, could also play a major role here. If you could get a monoclonal on admission to hospital that just protects you for the next couple of weeks, that's a very exciting idea. And you can do the same thing with newborns. There are monoclonals now with long half-lives that can be given a single intramuscular dose at birth and protect you for the first month or two of life, first 3 months of life, I say there. And animal vaccines that I'll come to right at the end. So what do we have in terms of good data on vaccine impact on resistance? And the model here is this pneumococcal conjugate vaccine. And it's a very interesting model because, unfortunately, the vaccine does not prevent all pneumococcal disease. It's a vaccine made up of capsules of the pneumococcus. Pneumococcus now has 98 known different capsules, and the existing vaccines only cover 10 to 13 of them. So there's a model here, unfortunately, for replacement. So once you get rid of the 10 to 13 strains that are there, you do have a problem of potential emergence of resistance in the remaining strains, and I'll talk a bit about that. So here's some direct evidence. This is a double-blind randomized trial of 40,000 kids, and the control group received a placebo, and the vaccine group received pneumococcal conjugate vaccine. And at the end of the trial, you can see that there were 28 kids who had a pneumococcus isolated from the blood that was penicillin resistant, and only 7 of them were in the vaccinated group and 21 in the control group. And the same for cotrimoxazole resistance, there was protection, and any antimicrobial resistance. So that's direct evidence from a randomized trial that a vaccine can reduce resistance in the pneumococcus. That happens to be a trial that I conducted in South Africa. At the same time, there was a trial conducted in Northern California, the same vaccine, essentially the same vaccine. And because it was in an HMO, they were able to collect all the antibiotic use in the trial. And so again, this is double-blind randomized trial, and the message here was that from dose 1 to age 3.5 years, the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine prevented a total of 35 antibiotic prescriptions per 100 children vaccinated. So that's a big impact on, of a vaccine on antimicrobial use. Most of the antimicrobials were used not for treating pneumonia, but in fact for treating ear infections, which this vaccine also prevents. So the last one I want to show on randomized trials and antibiotic use is another vaccine. There are 2 pneumococcal vaccines. The 2 I talked about earlier were produced by Pfizer. This is the competitor. This is the vaccine produced by GSK. It's used in Finland. And a very nice cluster randomized trial in Finland was looking at antibiotic use. But you see how many times antibiotics are prescribed to kids. So this was the vaccine impact on the first antimicrobial use in any given child. If they had more than 1 antibiotic use, so in other words, they had 2 episodes of antibiotic use, the vaccine impact actually increased a little, and it went up to 15 or more antibiotic courses to individual children. Now the ends are over here, so much less kids got 15 or more sets of antibiotics than the 7,000 who had 1 antibiotic exposure. But interestingly enough, a trend to increasing vaccine efficacy against the use of multiple antibiotics. And the idea behind this is that in fact the vaccine stops the initial ear infection, and then and then the kids who don't have their initial ear infection prevented end up with a damaged ear, and they're the ones who get the multiple antibiotics. So in fact, it has more impact on multiple than on just one. This is an ecological study in Finland that in fact was just e-published the other day, and I'm not going to make you read the whole thing, but it follows up from that trial to show that in Helsinki, there's less antibiotic use now for pneumococcal infections than, and less resistant strains. Proportion of penicillin non-susceptible, non-invasive isolates or invasive isolates in kids are all reduced. So they've been able to reduce antibiotic use for respiratory infections in Helsinki by rolling out the vaccine. Now, do we have that kind of ecological data here from the US? We do. So this is now a classic study that was published 10 years ago showing that when the vaccine was introduced in the US, this is just years, and there's the year of introduction in year 2000, penicillin susceptible disease, we're looking at kids less than 2, went down, but penicillin non-susceptible disease went down as well. There's a little bit of an ominous uptick there, which I'll come back to in a minute, but this was true also in other age groups. So this is 65-year-olds, and penicillin-resistant pneumococcal infections went down in 65-year-olds, not because they got the vaccine, but because this vaccine interrupts transmission in the community. So these vaccine strains went down in 65-year-olds through herd protection, and in fact the resistant strains, because everything on the slide is resistant, also went down. So the pattern of antimicrobial susceptibility from that same study, these are just years. So the vaccine then was introduced in the 99 is the pre-year, this red bar, the second one is the year the vaccine was introduced, and you'll see the percentage resistance to trimethoprim sulfa in kids went down and then started trending up again. And the same thing, penicillin went down and up again. So what's going on here? There was no similar impact in adults. So the selection, in fact, of resistant strains was occurring in kids. So these are the vaccine types going down, and then this is the emergence of resistance in non-vaccine types. And so this is, in fact, what was going on there. There was a particular strain not included in the vaccine called serotype 19A, and this is the year that the vaccine was introduced, and then you see this ascent of serotype 19A, and they're multiply resistant strains. And the highest line here is, in fact, kids less than 5, and the next line is adults over the age of 80. So a cautionary tale: if your vaccine doesn't prevent the major resistant strains, while you get an initial impact on resistance, you can get replacement with non-vaccine strains which become increasingly antibiotic resistant. So this is a picture now of another strain that's in no pneumococcal vaccine at the moment. And if you just follow over the years here, this is CDC surveillance, and you'll see there were none of those strains from 99 to 2002, and then in kids a few strains, and suddenly 12 in the last year of the study, and more dramatic in adults, sort of under 10, and suddenly over 105 strains. And when you look at the susceptibility of these strains, they were generally susceptible. 75% were susceptible to start, only 25% resistant. By the end, only 15% susceptible and 35% resistant. So some concerns there. Is this true also of developing countries? Can you reduce antimicrobial resistance? These are data from South Africa, and again, looking at resistant strains here, everything on the slide is resistant, and you can see the number of resistant infections going down over time, and plotted the same way as the CDC. In fact, even a more dramatic impact here are penicillin-sensitive strains going down in kids less than 2, and here are penicillin-resistant strains which were dominant, in fact, so more resistant than susceptible strains prior to the introduction of first the 7-valent and then the 13-valent vaccine, and a dramatic impact on AMR. So I said I would just briefly talk about flu. This is a flu trial and its impact on antibiotic use. So this is an influenza trial in children looking at episodes of otitis media. and they measured the mean number of antibiotic courses, and you'll see that it was halved. So 1.5 courses in the vaccinated kids, and then 2.5 courses of antibiotics in the control kids. Now, there's actually a really nice study that was just presented last month at ESPID, which is a pediatric infectious disease meeting. This is a very large study that was funded by GSK to look at their flu vaccine in kids. So they did a multinational trial, 5 independent cohorts of healthy kids, 12,000 kids randomized 1-to-1 either to their vaccine or to control. And in that study, they did look for antibiotic use, and you see a 50% reduction in antibiotic use in the kids who got flu vaccine compared to control. So again, another modality, a vaccine focused on respiratory disease to reduce antibiotic resistance. Measles has got to be, there's got to be huge impact of measles vaccine on AMR, but there's just nothing published. So I just showed this study showing that it has potential not only to prevent enormous burden of respiratory infections, but also antibiotic use. So to finish, I just want to make some observations from myself as a human ID doc on animal vaccines for AMR. There are many people in this room who know much more about this than I do, but just from what I heard yesterday, I put the slide together last night. So proof of concept in fish, and I did look at the data on this, is stunning. So the vaccination of salmon in Norway and the impact of that on antimicrobial use is enormous. And last night I heard at dinner that there's similar vaccines being developed for catfish farming here in the US. Proof of concept in chickens. I mean, I loved that presentation yesterday. It wasn't specifically stated like this, but I certainly saw a reciprocal relationship between the amount of money that Purdue was spending on vaccines and the amount of antibiotic use that they had in their chickens. David talked yesterday about the lack of vertical integration in the cattle industry, and therefore preconditioning with vaccines was not necessarily going forward at a pace that perhaps he felt it could. And I think there's enormous opportunity for vaccines to reduce antibiotic use in beef. I did speak to our folk at the Gates Foundation, and they listed a bunch of vaccines that they're interested in, all of which are currently against pathogens treated with antimicrobials. So my conclusion is that vaccines are obviously an essential part of controlling antibiotic use in animals as well as humans. And finally then, antibiotic use drives resistance to multiple antibiotic classes. Vaccines may reduce resistance, but continued use drives resistance in residual strains. So your vaccine is obviously very important. And that's what we've seen with PCV, this reduction. That overall, there's been a net benefit, but there has been emergence in non-vaccine strains. And then things like measles and influenza vaccine can impact antibiotic use. And there clearly is a need to consider development of vaccines and monoclonal antibodies in both veterinary and human use. So thanks for your attention.